Right, so it's not often that I can begin a video by saying something truly historic has just happened, but the latest ruling by the International Court of Justice with regards to Israel and Palestine is truly seismic, because every single lousy excuse that Israel has given for its presence in Palestine, its conduct in the West Bank and in Gaza, has just been rendered null and void. Whilst the apartheid state of Israel and Netanyahu himself attacked this decision on the basis of their alleged religious entitlement to the land they occupy, despite being historically incorrect as that is, as signatories to the Geneva Conventions, to the UN Charter, as a UN member state, the law will decide what is true and what is right and what is just. And it has, in no uncertain terms, effectively said, get the hell out of Palestine, you don't belong there, have no right to remain there a single day longer, and then some on top of that besides.
A number of participants have argued that Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory amount to segregation or apartheid in breach of Article 3 of CERD. Article 3 of CERD provides as follows, I quote, "States parties particularly condemn racial segregation and apartheid and undertake to prevent, prohibit, and eradicate all practices of this nature in territories under their jurisdiction." This provision refers to two particularly severe forms of racial discrimination, racial segregation, and apartheid. The court observed that Israel's legislation and measures imposed and serve to maintain a near complete separation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem between the settler and Palestinian communities. For this reason, the court considers that Israel's legislation and measures constitute a breach of Article 3 of CERD. Having found that Israel's settlement policy, its acts of annexation, and its related discriminatory legislation and measures are in breach of international law.
Right, so there aren't many moments these days, it seems, when sanity prevails, and that has certainly been the case when considering the mad genocidal actions of the Israeli government, not just since October 7th, but certainly that is when what they are really all about with regards to Palestine certainly entered the public psyche on a wider scale. That ruling from the ICJ, a clip of which you just saw, does count as one of those moments, though. It might surprise you to consider any kind of occupation as actually being legal, but under the terms of the Geneva Convention, this can be the case, and the rules are clearly laid out governing that, what the occupying state can and cannot do. And this has been the basis for Palestine being left under Israeli control since the aftermath of the Six-Day War back in 1967. An occupying power must, as a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, in this case the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 49 of which states that the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. It also prohibits the individual or mass forcible transfers as well as deportations of protected persons from occupied territory. This, of course, we know has been happening and happening for years now. Extensive use of land in the West Bank, as this applies to, where the West Bank has been divided up into three areas A, B and C, they've been imaginatively called, with only areas A and B under control of the Palestinian Authority. Area C is Israeli controlled. It's not news that Israel have been illegally building settlements and displacing Palestinians in the West Bank, driving them from their homes and their land for years to make way for settlers, and that this is something the settler movement, the likes of Nahala, want for Gaza as well, to take over, already having drawn up plans for new settlements to be built there. On top of that, as I covered a few weeks ago, Israel's hard-right finance minister, with a foot in the door of the Israeli Ministry of Defense as he also has, Bezalel Smotrich, has procured new powers from the IDF in relation to the West Bank, where he himself lives as a settler, to build even more settlements there, announcing the other week plans to build another 5,300 homes for Israelis in Palestinian territory. All of this, I should be quite clear, pretty obvious by this point, is against the Geneva Conventions and Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And therefore the legality of Israel's occupation is now completely and utterly null and void. The Israeli occupation of Palestine is now recognised by the International Court of Justice in their legal expertise, their opinion, their view, as an illegal occupation. It's taken 57 years to get to this point, but Israel is now acknowledged in law, albeit only advisory, but has no business being in Palestine whatsoever. And the rulings of the ICJ, that they have made in relation to this case, which it should be noted was brought to the ICJ this time not by the likes of a single or handful of nations like South Africa in this instance. It actually was brought to the ICJ by the United Nations General Assembly itself. They asked the ICJ to look at this. And after the court decided it did indeed have jurisdiction to answer the General Assembly's questions that they had put to it, relating to the ongoing violations of Israel versus the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, and how that affects the legal status of the Israeli occupation, the ICJ delivered some truly damning verdicts, and I don't think these points have been nailed nearly hard enough in the media. The continued presence of Israel in Palestinian territory is now unlawful. Full stop. Draw a line under it. As such, the presence of Israel in all occupied Palestinian territory, be it the West Bank or Gaza, must end, and Israel must withdraw as soon as possible. In light of that, Israel is obliged to cease all settlement activities immediately and evacuate all settlers from occupied Palestinian territory. On top of that, the court has voted that Israel is responsible for making reparations for the damage they have caused to all the natural or legal persons of the occupied Palestinian territories. The next ruling they made is going to cause massive headaches worldwide, so I'll quote this one directly. All states are under an obligation not to recognise as legal the situation arising from the unlawful presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, and not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by the continued presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. That means no aid, no weapons, no nothing to Israel if there is any risk, any remote chance it could be used to enable the ongoing, now legally recognised illegality of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. No more weapons from the US is the knee-jerk immediate thought, but it goes for every other nation too. And as the next ruling made clear, that doesn't just extend to all other nations, but it extends to the United Nations itself. So anyone voting against blocking aid and weapons at the UN Security Council, for example, vetoing things, as the US have got a habit of doing, would in theory be violating this ICJ ruling. Of course, the ruling is only advisory. It isn't in and of itself a legally binding judgment. That would take far longer to arrive at. However, the final ruling they arrived at does make clear what the UN ought to do in light of these other rulings. The United Nations, and especially the General Assembly, which requested this opinion, and the Security Council, should consider the precise modalities and further action required to bring to an end as rapidly as possible the unlawful presence of the State of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. It is therefore incumbent on the UN and Security Council to not ignore this ruling. After all, that undermines the point of there even being an International Court of Justice, does it not? And undermines its authority. If it just gets ignored for the sake of Israel, and any state now ignoring this would effectively be placing the importance of Israel above the importance of the United Nations itself. Now, the interesting thing here is this ruling on the illegality of the Israeli occupation is that, really, if you think about it, because Israel withdrew its settlers from Gaza in 2003, this really only applies to the West Bank. However, because Gaza is part of the occupied Palestinian territories as a collective, the ruling ends up covering Gaza too. Despite actually, from a legal standpoint, this ruling doesn't actually apply to Gaza. You can't split a nation state, though, even if geographically they are separate. So it's a weird little quirk of this ruling that I found rather novel anyway. It's also worth noting that this ruling comes from a United Nations request made to the ICJ all the way back in December of 2022. So well before the most recent atrocities in Gaza took place. And it was backed then by 87 countries to make this request of the ICJ for this advisory opinion. And it's taken this long to get that far. It was notable that it was opposed by, of course, the United States, but also the UK, Germany, and obviously by Israel itself. All the same countries still falling over themselves for Israel's sake now, for example, trying to block those arrest warrants for Netanyahu at the ICC, and the US threatening sanctions against people at the ICC and the ICC itself. But blocking those arrest warrants, as UK and now Germany are effectively trying to do, to all of our eternal shame, I'm sure. Effectively, the court has ruled that Israel have illegally annexed the West Bank in practice, if not in name. And Israeli responses have not really denied that at all. Naturally, Israel have rejected the ruling, obviously, so the UN should come down on them like a ton of bricks over that as a UN member state refusing to uphold this ruling, with Netanyahu himself, because of course he's tweeted out, sending out a message saying, "The Jewish people are not occupiers in their own land, including in our eternal capital Jerusalem, nor in Judea and Samaria, our historical homeland. No absurd opinion in The Hague can deny this historical truth or the legal right of Israelis to live in their own communities in our ancestral home." But it isn't your ancestral home. The father of the Jewish people was Abraham, and he came from Iraq. The region you now occupy has historically been under Muslim occupation for far longer than it ever has been under Jewish. And given, along with Christianity, all three of those religions have their roots in this same area in the Middle East, why does Jewish occupation take precedence anyway? Netanyahu and many others as well cite religion as their right to be there, but actually it comes down to British imperial idiocy that actually put them there. A legal framework, stupid as it was. But laws can be extremely stupid, as we know. So they need to get over themselves. Your occupation has been ruled illegal. You got no right to be in those territories any longer. If the UN does not enforce that and censure any nation siding with Israel on this going forwards, then it will severely undermine itself. It's over. Israel have to leave. They must leave. It has been recognised as an apartheid state in law now, as well as these rulings also do, which is why reparations must now be paid. And from a narrative standpoint, so must it be the case for everyone who has been calling this out for so long. Boycott, divestment and sanctions campaigners have been completely vindicated. It is no longer a debate that Zionists have a justifiable position on this any longer, not that they had any before, but their arguments are now completely irrelevant. Israel has been declared by the ICJ to be a rogue state, enacting apartheid and land occupation and illegal settlement, operating outside of international law. So anyone who claims to respect international law, so I'm now looking at you, Keir Starmer, having just this week spoken of your profound respect for international law, cannot possibly side with Israel for a moment longer. End this nonsense at the ICC. Stop the shame of this country backing Israel constantly, because that is now no longer a justifiable position at all for as long as they remain in Palestinian territory. Or move over for someone else who isn't as bought and paid for by the Israel lobby as you are. People are watching. Meanwhile, matters for Netanyahu go from bad to worse, as the Houthis in Yemen, for months now having been a major source of economic and military conflict over Israel's war in Gaza, have now successfully struck Tel Aviv itself with a new drone capable of travelling the distance. And if they have it now, then Iran backed as they are, how long before Hezbollah do? More and more the case is made for responsible withdrawal from Gaza in Israel's own interests at this point. And with them now legally required to get out of the West Bank too, the global narrative towards the rogue state has likely shifted to a point where there is no going back on this. Get the details of that Houthi strike in this video recommendation here. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.